Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. Welcome back to our show. My name is Bjorn Skaptison, and I will be the administrator for this show. Therefore, good news for you. You're not going to see this mug much. We're going to turn it right over to our author and our host in just a moment. But a little housekeeping before we launch into that. Today's guest is Professor Jonathan W. White, whom you shall meet in just a moment. His book is To Address You as My Friend. African Americans' Letters to Abraham Lincoln comes to us from University of North Carolina Press. And we thank them for publishing the book and helping us get John White on the program today. 280 pages. The cost is $29.95. And again, the main thing today, order the book. Order the book. That is why we are able to bring these authors to you on A House Divided. You haven't been able to come into Abraham Lincoln Bookshop for book signings in the last 2 years because of the pandemic, but we are still doing author discussions and live book signings, and you will get, when you order, a first edition copy of the book and a signed custom Abraham Lincoln Bookshop book plate. So I think that takes care of our housekeeping. So with that taken care of, I will introduce you to your host for the program, Daniel Weinberg of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop.
Well, thank you so much, Bjorn, and welcome everyone to another House Divided. And this time I'm in the studio and we're still doing things by Zoom. Jonathan, next time we'll try to get you in here. We have you coming in next year. So Jonathan White is Associate Professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University. And he's Vice Chair of the Lincoln Forum and has two of the cutest kids in Christendom. Now, he's an author and editor of several previous books, including the engrossing Midnight in America, Darkness, Sleep, and Dreams During the Civil War. His latest book, To Address You as My Friend, which I have right in back of me here, African Americans' Letters to Abraham Lincoln, University of North Carolina Press, 280 pages and illustrated, and it's $29.95 and worth every penny. The book calls you an editor, Jonathan, but I'll tell you, you're more than that, because you give very informative comments in leading up to each particular letter, and then explain the result of what happened with that letter, if you can. So let's start off for a moment. You're Vice Chair of the Lincoln Forum. We just came off of it this past weekend, or the end of the week. Please give us a quick recipe of what the Lincoln Forum is.
Sure. So the Lincoln Forum is a group of people who love Abraham Lincoln, and every November 16th through the 18th, we get together in Gettysburg and have speakers and tours and panel discussions, lots of great meals and fellowship over breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And all members, I'll just highlight this, get a copy of the Lincoln Forum Bulletin twice a year that I edit. It's full color. And the back always has an advertisement from the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. So I've got to show that as well. But it's a really wonderful way for people to get together and think about and talk about Abraham Lincoln.
And we had over 300 people this time, I think, full house, even in these times. And we seemed all to be pretty safe. It was a wonderful time.
Yeah, it really was. It was good to be back together off of Zoom for once.
Exactly. So let's begin looking at your book. How and why did you begin this project? What brought you to it?
I started going through the Papers of Abraham Lincoln website, where they've put up online more than 80,000 letters to or from Abraham Lincoln, and started finding letters from African Americans. And this was about 2014. And I just decided at that point that I was going to systematically look for as many letters from African Americans as I could find and see if I could turn it into a book. It took about 7 years to finish, but I'm really pleased with the final product. And the thing is that when we think about African-American voices during the Civil War, they're often mediated through a white person. So someone hears a Black person say something or has a conversation with them, and they write down what they think they heard. In the case of these letters, it's people writing for themselves, so you really get their own voices.
Well, I think voice is the right thing. I agree with your assessment that this is a valuable contribution to our understanding of African American life during the war, something we don't usually see or get. It's the first time we have those compelling voices in front of us. Are there numbers of letters, many more that are that could have been used that are still out there?
It's a great question. I put in every letter that I found, with one exception. That was a report that an African-American wrote for Lincoln. That was a very long report on colonization that just would have taken up too much space and appeared as a newspaper article. There are certainly more letters buried at the National Archives or the Library of Congress or in private collections that I just wasn't able to find. I even had to stop my research in some cases because of the pandemic. There were some things I wanted to look into, and then the National Archives closed and I just couldn't get back to check them out. So I put in everything that I found, but I'm sure, next time I go to the National Archives, I'll find another one and I'll think, oh, if only I could have included this one too.
Sure, always. And the moment any book is published, there's always something that comes up that the author could have used.
Yep.
You do have a little bit of, at the beginning of your methodology and your methods of presenting them.
Yeah.
Could you tell us briefly about the research and presentation?
Sure. So I organized the letters thematically. And so each chapter focuses on a different type of reason people are writing to Lincoln. So one chapter focuses on petitions for pardon. And this is something that scholars of African-American history have not utilized pardon records as far as I've been able to tell. And I found probably about a dozen letters from African-Americans who were either convicted of a crime or writing on behalf of a convict asking for Lincoln to pardon them. Then I have letters related to colonization, Christian ministries who ask for financial support, soldiers and their families writing about the pay inequality issue for US colored troops, all sorts of different themes. And then the last chapter consists of letters that are essentially thank you notes to Lincoln, thanking him for emancipation or wishing him well, or telling him on a personal level of how they're doing, what they're learning, if they're learning how to read and write. And so I try to have the letters be in these different groups that allow the reader to really feel immersed in a certain particular kind of issue that faces the Black community of the Civil War era as they go chapter by chapter.
What did you do about spelling and punctuation?
So my goal was to render these as close to the original as possible, because I think that, as we talked about a moment ago, the voices of these writers really comes out in their spelling. Most of the letters, or many of the letters, are spelled phonetically. This is a semi-literate people. And when they're thinking about how do I spell something, they're kind of sounding it out in their minds and then writing the letters that come to mind. And I didn't want to add punctuation. I didn't want to add correct spellings. There are a few cases where words would be so hard for the ordinary reader to decipher that I bracketed what I believe the writer was trying to say. But in most cases, they're just a transcription of the writing itself. And my hope is that will, again, give readers an ability to step back in time and hear voices that otherwise have been lost.
Yeah,
now, about 14 of these letters appear in those massive volumes of the Freedmen and Southern Society Project. So the overwhelming have never been published before, but 14 have appeared in those volumes. And I will say there are some instances where I render words and phrases differently than they do, because I read them and I saw something different than what those editors, who I greatly admire, saw. And my hope is that people will find this to just be a really valuable tool and an interesting read.
Did Lincoln always know which letters came from African Americans? Was that communicated to him maybe through Nicolay and Hay. We'll talk about them in a moment. But did he always know that this was an African-American voice coming to him?
It's a great question.
Because some of even though it was a fairly literate soldiery on both sides, you and I both have seen numbers of letters that are phonetically done.
Yeah, no, he did not always know. So many of the writers will say something like, as a member of a despised race, or as a former slave, or as a colored person, they would say. So some of the letters are very upfront in that way. But a lot of them I would read and I would think, well, I think this is probably an African-American, but I'm not sure. So then I would have to do research, go to ancestry.com and dig into the census records, or go to the newspapers and see if I could find evidence, because even if the writer didn't identify him or herself as Black, if they were tried in court for a crime, it would usually say, state versus so-and-so, colored or Negro, in parentheses after their name. And so that's how I could confirm that some of these writers were African Americans. There's one letter that I so badly wanted to include. It was written from Toronto. I'm 99% sure it was written by an African American, but it was signed anonymously. It was signed with a pseudonym, and I didn't feel right including it without knowing for certain.
Sure.
But in some cases, I had to go to city directories. There were all sorts of different research tools I had at my disposal.
Couldn't do that. So he many times you say really didn't know who it was unless they said colored or something along that line. You quote, I think, John Hay in saying that Lincoln read 1 in 50 letters that came in, maybe 200 to 300 letters a day came in there. How many of those do you think Hay and Nicolay read, and what did their screening methods, if you know?
Yeah, so what they would normally do, they operated under the rule of refer as little to the president as possible. And so what usually happens with these letters is they come in and Hay or Nicolay or another secretary looks at them and then refers it to the appropriate department of the federal government. And so it sort of wends its way through the federal bureaucracy. But oftentimes they then have to come back to Lincoln for final disposition. And so, the most wonderful thing is when you flip over a letter and you look at all the docketing, and then the last one is signed A. Lincoln, and you know that it came back to him.
Yeah, he endorsed them. And most of the endorsements that we see don't go directly, I think, from Hay and Nicolay. As you say, it wends its way to the right department and then comes back, because it's always docketing in red pencil and a clerk saying what is inside. And then it comes to Lincoln. Then he writes his endorsement, and it goes on from there. Very briefly, because I think this is important, you say as well that this book, although aimed at general readers, isn't particularly aimed at students. And what approach should students take with this book? What questions might they be asking as they read what you have?
Well, I think that the letters give such an intimate look into the daily experiences of people who were suffering tremendously during the Civil War. And so I think students are going to be startled by the letters from wives of soldiers who say, my children are starving, I need bread and I can't support them. What can you do to help me? Or the soldiers who say, I need to get paid because I know my family is suffering. And so I'm going to be assigning the book in a class this spring. The class is going to focus on the Civil War and film, and I'm going to break up the chapters and assign different ones at different points. So we're going to watch Glory. And of course, the pay issue is a huge issue in Glory, where the soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts mutiny and refuse to accept a diminished pay. And so I'm going to have them read the chapter on soldiers' pay and the chapter on soldiers who get court-martialed before we watch the movie. And my hope is that that'll give us a chance to have a great discussion on it.
One of your illustrations show Negroes getting paid.
Yep.
And I like that as an illustration in there. They got paid, I presume, separately and less than other soldiers. So let me ask you about this too. You said Lincoln retained, now look, we just had another white here, Ron White,
Hmm.
with his Lincoln in Private book,
Yeah.
which had numerous notes Lincoln wrote for and to himself for later use. But you say that Lincoln did retain some of these letters from African Americans, one being a poem. Is there a pattern to the letters that he kept? What sort of letters did he keep? And were they all kept together, and are they still around like that?
Yeah, so out of the 125 letters in the book, a very small number come from the newspapers. The vast majority come from the National Archives, but 21 of them are in the Lincoln papers at the Library of Congress. And those are letters that Lincoln kept in his personal collection of papers that didn't get routed through the federal bureaucracy and then wind up in some record group in Washington, D.C. And those are letters. You mentioned the one of Hannibal Cox. He's a former slave from Tennessee who learns how to read. He sends Lincoln a poem, and that he didn't write. He copied it out of Harper's. But then at the very bottom, he includes a postscript where he asks Lincoln not to laugh at him. You get the sense he knows his commander-in-chief, or he believes his commander-in-chief is going to hold this letter, and he knows that Lincoln might have a visceral reaction and laugh that, he's not highly educated. And so he puts that in there. Other letters in that collection at the Library of Congress include letters from famous ministers. Frederick Douglass has a letter in that collection. Billy the Barber, who is Lincoln's very close friend and barber and law client in Springfield, he wrote to Lincoln in December of 1863. Those are the kind of letters that Lincoln kept, and they are still together at the Library of Congress.
Now, the book is divided into three categories, general categories: chief executive, commander-in-chief, and chief citizen. Are there any common threads that go through these various, or are they all different in these categories? You do mention nation, sacrifice, and loyalty.
Yeah.
So we'll get into the subcategories as we go along, but to show the variety, you've already talked about that, but what are the common threads throughout those three large categories, if there are?
I think the biggest themes that carry throughout, you have the pay issue. So Black soldiers getting paid less. There's a whole chapter on that, but that issue touches every other aspect of a soldier's family's life. So that comes up a lot. As you mentioned, the loyalty issue. One of the things that many African Americans point out in their correspondence with Lincoln is there is a whole group of people who are fighting to destroy this country. We are loyal. We are the most loyal people in the country, and therefore we should have rights, the rights of citizenship. You can trust us to not be like the rebels. I think another major issue that comes out throughout is this idea of equality, that separate from the pay issue, African Americans are looking for an equal place in society. And so, there's a chapter on colonization. Lincoln is trying to put pressure on African American leaders to take Black people out of the country to Liberia or to Panama. And their response is, this is our country. We have been born here. We've lived here our whole lives. We've been here for generations. We don't want to go somewhere else. We want equality. And so those are a lot of the themes that I think you would expect to see, and that do come up consistently throughout the different letters. And then the last one I'll just say is suffering. Now, regardless of race, almost everyone was suffering in a terrible way during the Civil War, with men dying on the battlefield and families suffering at home. But that's another theme that you really see throughout the letters.
Might there have been a fourth category, chief lawyer? Because certainly the Emancipation Proclamation brought his legal skills into play, but in these letters, he's sometimes asked to kind of act like a lawyer, which was his lifetime profession. An example was Robert Williams, a contraband who was asking that his pregnant wife get released from prison. How often were his legal skills used in these particular letters?
Yeah, so that one shows up in the first chapter, which is on presidential pardons. And so, yeah, he is certainly thinking as a lawyer throughout the different letters. And I think his training as a lawyer, and then of course his reading of Euclid, those kind of things give him a very logical approach to dealing with the issues that come before him as a wartime president. It's funny because there's one letter that I love. It's in I put it in the chief citizen portion. And it's a man who writes to Lincoln and says, essentially, I have property in Delaware or Philadelphia, and the local authorities are taking it from me, and I need legal advice. And he writes to Lincoln as Abraham Lincoln and Company, as if he thinks Lincoln could maybe represent him in court. So people were thinking about him that way.
Well, they were also thinking about him as the government, as you mentioning here.
Yes.
Most of them, now, before I get to that, let me ask you a very quick question. Most of these, maybe all of these letters come from freedmen and those who were free already, or soldiers who were slaves before. You don't get anything across lines from slaves, I presume.
There is one letter from a woman who is still in bondage, and that's a very famous letter from Annie Davis. And she writes to Lincoln in August of 1864 and says, I want to visit my relatives on the eastern shore of Maryland. My mistress won't let me. Can you tell me, am I free? And that letter was originally discovered by Ira Berlin and the Freedmen and Southern Society Project. And sadly, she was not yet free. It's not until November 1st that slavery ends in Maryland, November 1st, 1864. There are dozens of letters from former slaves, but I think she's the only one who is technically still in bondage when she writes.
So you go back to what we were just talking about, that as a lawyer, they felt that he was representing them. But as I said, you also mentioned that many of the blacks, freedmen, believed Lincoln as Uncle Sam was the government.
Yeah.
Did he take the place of authority for them after the slave owners were gone? Is that the place that they saw him?
Yeah, I think so. So in my analysis of that, I relied on Benjamin Quarles, the great historian, Black historian from the mid 20th century. And he has a book from the 60s called Lincoln and the Negro. And he suggests that African Americans in the 19th century really equated their politics with a personality. And so for them during the Civil War era, Lincoln is their politics. When they think about politics, they're thinking about Lincoln. And when Lincoln dies, there are slaves who are recorded by white listeners who they hear former slaves saying, Uncle Sam is dead, the government is dead, because Lincoln has died. And so they don't know, are they going to be sent back into bondage now that the man they see as a liberator has been killed?
Did most of the letters that were written, I think you mentioned something, or maybe we won't have to go into this, but the letters from blacks, did they reflect what Lincoln was seeing from white people writing to them? The same issues mainly across those two lines, black and white?
There is some overlap, and then there are some differences. So
what were the differences you see especially?
Some of the differences have to do with how they serve as soldiers. So African Americans are writing about the pay issue. That's not an issue for white soldiers. White soldiers are often writing to Lincoln seeking promotion. Now, there are some black men who write to Lincoln offering to recruit soldiers, but they can't really be promoted through the ranks because of segregation in the army, and that white officers oversee black regiments. But then similarities have to do with families asking for assistance, asking for money. African American soldiers are refusing their pay, but there were massive issues with the army and the treasury getting soldiers paid in general. So white soldiers and black soldiers and their families are often saying, we haven't gotten paid in 6 months, 7 months, we need to get paid. And so that is a commonality.
Were there professional scriveners who wrote for those who could not write? Because not all of the black letters that are in this book, I presume, were really written by the person himself or herself. They had to have someone do that. Do you know the professionals who they went to? Was there a cost to it that you know of?
Well, some of them had teachers. So 3 of the letters in the book are from African Americans, but they were written by teachers because the former slaves were not literate. A few of them were written by lawyers and then marked with an X where the defendant couldn't write for him or herself. I don't know of any professionals. In some cases, they had chaplains write for them. So chaplains are literate, and because they're officers and they need to be able to make reports. And so there are some instances where chaplains write. And then another thing that often happens is that men will band together. So in one case, there's a petition signed by 74 men in the 55th Massachusetts, and they are protesting the pay issue. And it's written by one man, John Freeman Shorter, who's a sergeant. So he's an officer, a non-commissioned officer and literate, and then 73 others sign it. And there are other cases like that too, where one person writes it and then other names are on the petition as well.
Now, there's a case in there about a Black officer asking for a commission, or a Black asking for a commission. What percent of Blacks who served actually received officer commissions?
Minuscule. There are between 180 and 200,000 African Americans, men who serve in the Union Army during the Civil War. There is some scholarship now that's finding that there were more Black officers than we realized. I don't know what the numbers are. The one I think you're referring to is Alexander Thomas Augusta. He is born free in Norfolk, Virginia, and then I think right after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, his family settles in Baltimore. He wants to be a doctor. He applies to Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia, gets rejected on account of his race, and so he gets medical training in Toronto. And he practices medicine for about 6 years, and then Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. And about 7 or 9 days later, Augusta sends a letter to Lincoln saying, I want to be of use to my race. I want to be a surgeon in the Army. And Lincoln brings him down to Washington, and the Army Board of Medical Examiners refuses to examine him. And Edwin Stanton intervenes, makes sure he gets the examination, and he passes with flying colors. He winds up having incredible obstacles to overcome as an officer in the Army, but he becomes the highest ranking officer in the African-American officer in the Union Army during the war.
So early on in the book, in the introduction, if I remember correctly, and you already spoke about Billy the Barber, and there is Billy the Barber, William Floraville. And most of us Lincoln obsessive, as Spielberg calls us, knows of William Floraville. He was one of the closest Blacks to Lincoln, I think, and he even seemed to confide in him at times.
Yeah.
Is there any other in the book that was as close? Keckley was, of course, Elizabeth Keckley was close to Mary, but not probably as much, although she must have seen Lincoln there too. She probably was not writing to Lincoln. I had not seen any letters that way. But tell us about Billy the Barber and he wrote, but how close was he?
Sure. Yeah. So William Floraville was a Haitian immigrant who moved to New Orleans and then Baltimore, and then was deciding to settle in Springfield. And one day in 1831, he's passing through this small town called New Salem, Illinois. And there he meets an ugly young guy, apparently wearing flannel, who says, hey, why don't you come back to my house tonight and have somewhere to sleep and have a meal? And that flannel wearing guy was Abraham Lincoln, if the 1880s or 90s county histories are to be believed. And Floraville then moves to Springfield, and 6 years later, Lincoln follows and they maintain a friendship. Floraville cuts his hair, Lincoln does his legal work and his tax work. Floraville becomes a very prominent person in Springfield. And when Floraville died, the newspaper said there were 2 men who knew Abraham Lincoln intimately. Billy Herndon, his law partner, and Billy Floraville, his barber. The other person I would say who writes to Lincoln, who's close to him, is William Slade, who is the White House valet. And in 1863, there's a group of African Americans from Pennsylvania who really want one particular white officer to be appointed to be in command of a Black regiment. And they write a petition to Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and Slade writes a little endorsement. He writes a cover letter, essentially, saying, I endorse this petition. And you have to imagine he handed it to Lincoln. I mean, again, these guys are close. I think that one is still in the Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress. He had a very close relationship with Lincoln. And you mentioned Spielberg. Slade, of course, is depicted in the film.
Yes, he is. Even though I have an interesting question ready to go, I think Bjorn might have one too.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Dan, good news. You are going to get to ask the next question. But I wanted to chime in here about halfway through our conversation and send greetings to those who are watching us live, because this is a very popular program. Well, our programs are always very popular, but we have enough people watching today, making comments, making shout outs, that I wanted to just say hello and send greetings to the people that are watching. Many of them are our friends, and so we always like to recognize you. We're fortunate today that Rich Condon is watching, and Rich is down there at Reconstruction National Historic Site, so he may have some commentary.
Can I say that Rich sent me a text while we were going live? Look at that.
So Rich really wants his question asked, so we'll make sure that it gets there. Dave Bradley is watching from the UK, and Dave Wiegers is watching from Gurnee, Illinois. And it appears as though Dave and Dave are going to meet. I think that might happen sometime in the near future. They're always watching these live streams together. So hello, Dave, and hello, Dave. Bob Willard is watching from the West Coast and says that definitely recommends that people should be joining Lincoln Forum. And he said it was a thrill for him to see both of you there last week. We've got Bill Gorski from Arlington Heights, Lynn Bristol, Chip Brown, Dennis Doyle, Irving Moy, Dan Madsen is watching from Denver. He often watches. Hello, Dan. And there are some folks that have some questions and comments, but you know what I'm going to do is hold the questions for a few more minutes, and then I'll pop back in maybe 15 minutes or so and share the questions. But I want to send the greetings right now so that we could get them in. Hey, Dan, you had a question, a perfect follow-up question for what you were just doing.
I don't know if it's a follow-up, but it's my next question. So I was going to talk about a few of the subcategories and try to go through these so we can give more flavor. One of them was discharges from service. And you say that this is an underwritten about subject. Yeah. There were requests for discharge. What did they reveal?
They reveal a great deal about the way that Black men get into the Army in some cases. So they ask to get out of the Army because in some cases they were gotten drunk and then forced into the Army against their will, they say. In some cases they are minors and they try to get out of the Army, or their parents try to get them out of the Army because they're underage. Two that I'll mention along those lines. There was a man named Hiram Vale who was in Ohio. He was biracial. His son passed for white and was able to enlist in the Army, and his son did it without his permission. And this is right at the moment where Nathaniel Gordon gets executed for slave trading. And Hiram Vale writes to Lincoln and says, my son is in the Army against my will. The officer refused, the colonel of the regiment refuses to let him go, even though I got rid of habeas corpus. And he says, I thought kidnapping was illegal. In other words, you execute a man who kidnaps Africans and sells them into slavery, but you allow the Army to kidnap 16-year-olds and take them into the service. That was one of the really interesting ones. Another one comes from a minor who enlisted, and he was right down in Rich Condon's neck of the woods in South Carolina, and he wants to get out of the Army. And so he writes a letter to his dad, and he says, I've written a letter to Lincoln, and I've signed it in your name. Send it to Lincoln as if it's from you. And his dad didn't understand what the son was saying. And so his dad just included the son's letter and then wrote his own, or included the second one. And so you see this case where the father and son are trying to trick Lincoln in order to help get the son a discharge from the Army. So they really tell incredible stories about soldier life.
another subcategory were mementos or gifts
Mhm.
that were given. Some years ago, it's been a good 15, 20 years, the National Archives put on a little display, big display of gifts given to various presidents from back in Jefferson's day all the way to the present. Fascinating. The one that I loved the best, frankly, was to LBJ. There was a new shovel
Hmm.
in that little area for LBJ books, gifts. And it was you can go to Sears, and if that's still alive, and buy the shovel. And what the guy wrote to Lincoln, to LBJ was, you don't have the guts to win the war. You don't have the guts to get out. Here's a shovel to bury last week's dead.
Wow.
I thought that was amazing. Now, let's talk about some of those that maybe some of the African Americans might have sent to Lincoln in gifts or mementos. For instance, this is not one of those, but here's one we've just gotten. That's folk art showing emancipation. And you can see the pen, that feather pen that Lincoln never would have used, breaking the chains of slavery on the Emancipation Proclamation. So
Wow.
here is a piece of folk art. Were any pieces of folk art or something else sent to Lincoln by African Americans? And if so, did he personally keep any of them?
Yeah. So one woman who was called a self-emancipated woman in Natchez, Mississippi, sent Lincoln something that's called a Liberty cake. And I don't know exactly what that is, but she baked something and sent it in. A piece of folk art that Lincoln received came from a Philadelphia woman who she was very talented at making sculptures, and she made a sculpture, a glass vase that she presented to him that looked like a bowl of fruit. And she actually personally took it to the White House in April of 1864 and delivered it to him, gave it to him in the White House, what was then the White House Library. And Mary was there, and she was there, and her pastor was there, and they presented it to Lincoln, and she talked about how meaningful emancipation was. The Liberty cake has long since disappeared, if it even made it to the White House. The fruit display has disappeared. I've tried. Mary Lincoln apparently loved it so much that she sent it back to Springfield, but I've contacted the National Park site out there. They don't know of its whereabouts. The one other gift that comes to mind that is not folk art per se, but in September of 1864, the Black community of Baltimore presented Lincoln with a beautiful purple velvet pulpit Bible. And that remained in Robert's hands until the early 20th century, when he gave it to Fisk University in Nashville. And if you go to the John Hope and Aurelia Franklin Library at Fisk, you can actually see this Bible that was given to Lincoln and that Lincoln looked over with Sojourner Truth. It's a really incredible gift.
You presaged one of my questions before on colonization.
Okay.
And almost answer the entirety. I want to ask you a couple of quick questions, because that's part of your book too.
Yeah.
And you give some examples of Northern Blacks supporting colonization. And I know that some Southerners did as well. For instance, strangely enough, I have this note right here written by Lincoln. And he has in front of him in the executive mansion, here you can see a little bit better maybe, if I can do it like that.
Yeah.
A Mrs. Tubman, not Harriet, who turns out to be a Southern plantation woman who owns a huge number of slaves, and she sent some of them, if they wanted to, she offered to send them to Liberia.
Right.
And about 68 of them from her plantation took that up, and she sent them there and helped them. One of them even became president, descendant of Liberia in the late 30s, 1930s. But what do I want to ask? Is it correct what you were, well, so how did he handle this? There were people who wanted to support it, others not. So let's get to why he changed his mind.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly it's known that blacks came in, and you mentioned that, they said they wanted to be, they were loyal, even though they had been slaves and their brethren were slaves then, they seemed to want to remain Americans. Is that why he really backed away?
I think that's part of it. I think part of it is the valor that Black men show on the battlefield, and that if they're willing to fight and die for this country, then they deserve a place in the body politic. I think he comes to that position. And I think the other reason is that there was a failed colonization experiment off the coast of Haiti, and it was a disaster, and many people died. And the government contractor who said he was going to set up schools and hospitals and things didn't do that. And so I think it's a combination of that failed attempt, Black men fighting in the army, and realizing after emancipation that, for Lincoln, it was always voluntary. It was never deportation. It was always trying to persuade people to leave the country. But he comes to see that most African Americans don't want to leave the country. Now, that said, a surprising number of African Americans wrote to Lincoln, and their letters are in this book, where they are in favor of colonization. And part of me wonders if maybe that gave him a false sense of support among African Americans for colonization. And maybe that's why he held on to the idea longer than we maybe wish he had.
Interesting. That's an interesting point. A footnote that you had in chapter 2, number 20, caught my attention.
Okay.
And it was about an 1858 meeting of Maryland slaveholders. It was a convention that Maryland slaveholders put together. And they decided not to expel free blacks from their state. And my first thought, gosh, was that Enlightenment? I'm not so sure about that. I think it was mainly because they wanted to keep their labor, even if they were free. But did this in some way help Maryland decide not to actively support and join, I should say, the Confederacy?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think the 1858 convention did necessarily. Baltimore is a very secessionist hub in Maryland, but there are a lot of unionists in Maryland as well. I wrote a book about the Merryman case in 1861, and I think a big reason that the state of Maryland didn't secede is that the Union Army was able to start taking control of the areas around Baltimore and Annapolis by early May of 1861. And then, of course, Lincoln has a large number of the state legislature arrested in September. So I think it's a combination of the military presence and the presence of Unionists that keeps Maryland in the Union.
I just thought of an artifact that I wanted to show, but it's in the other room, so I shan't. But it's an emancipation piece, right after the Emancipation Proclamation in 63, 64, early 65. There were numbers of prints, large prints that were produced, very colorful, many of them, most of them showing the Emancipation Proclamation, many of them in script, and many of them had images. This particular one, a couple of them have these images, and on one side they would show slavery and the horrors of that. On the other side, they show different images of freed slaves, freed men going to school, doing professions, etc. Yeah. There were numbers of them, the 50 odd that Charles Eberstadt in his bibliography lists during Lincoln's lifetime. Do you think a large, I don't want to say a large number, but a significant number were purchased by freedmen and women, and not especially just by abolitionists? Do you have any idea on that?
It's hard to know, but I can tell you anecdotally, there are a number of instances where people wrote about African Americans having prints of Lincoln hanging on their walls in their homes after emancipation, including in the South. In some cases, that led to angry whites who see it and respond angrily. And I published a book chapter with Anna Holloway on the Monitor in popular culture. And one of the things we found that was really interesting was that there were Black newspapers in Richmond and other southern states after the war that are advertising these kind of prints that you're describing, and also prints of the Monitor. So there had to be a market among African Americans for these kind of images.
Before we bring Bjorn in here, I had a question that I really wanted to ask you as well. And that is the subject of slaves freeing themselves. One of today's narratives is that of slaves freeing themselves with their feet. And it certainly happened. And there's an illustrated story. You talked about the story of Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, and Douglass's letter to Lincoln. But you also said that not as many were fleeing into the Union lines as Lincoln had hoped.
Yeah.
So today's narrative versus Lincoln not seeing as many as he hoped. Can you comment on the disparity of this thought?
Sure. So as you mentioned, the predominant view among scholarly historians of the Civil War is this idea of self-emancipation, that the slaves free themselves and that they force Lincoln essentially to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And one of the issues with self-emancipation, and I'll say there is truth to that, right? There is truth that slaves run away and gain freedom. But their freedom is not legal freedom until the Emancipation Proclamation and then the 13th Amendment. And one of the problems that we have is just not knowing how many people ran away and went to contraband camps or became refugees in Washington. The estimates used to be around 200 or 250,000. Now scholars are saying 500,000. We really don't know. And there's a pretty big difference between 200 and 500,000. From Lincoln's perspective, the summer of 1864 was a really terrible time with the Overland Campaign, 60,000 casualties in the Union Army in 6 weeks. Sherman is stuck outside of Atlanta, and Lincoln is convinced that he's going to lose re-election. And so in August of 1864, he calls Frederick Douglass to the White House and says what you just said: the slaves are not running away as much as possible. We need to do whatever we can to get word out so that people become free before I lose re-election and I'm out of office. And so Douglass then goes back and writes a letter to Lincoln, which is in the book, laying out a strategy modeled after John Brown about sending what Douglass calls bands of scouts into the Confederacy, basically shouting to the slaves, get away now while Lincoln is office, because once McClellan has won, he's going to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. What's remarkable about this meeting is that freedom that Lincoln and Douglass were trying to secure for slaves had nothing to do with winning the war. It had everything to do with making freedom as broad and as permanent as possible. So people who criticize Lincoln, oh, well, he only freed the slaves because he had to as a military necessity. No, Lincoln is trying to make freedom as available to anyone who can seize it. The other point, and this is to your question, from Lincoln's, even if 500,000 enslaved people run away, and I think that number is probably too high, but even if it's 500,000, there are still 3.5 million people still in bondage who don't become free until the Union Army moves forward and the war comes to an end. And so I think with the self-emancipation debate, I think we have to acknowledge the role of the enslaved people who run away, the role of the Union Army that becomes an army of liberation, and the role of Lincoln as the person who's creating policy in all of this.
I have a couple of questions that I want to get to, but I'll let Bjorn come in first because he must have something of import to ask right now.
Oh, everything I say is important.
Of course.
At least that's what
why you're here at the shop.
My mom tells me. Yeah. No, we have some really good questions from the folks who are watching. This has been a popular topic, and we have some really good questions. Now, one thing, Dan Weinberg has been on a bit of a roll today in that he asked at least 2 of the questions that the customers asked, even as they were asking them.
Wow.
So I'll repeat them, and and John, if you have anything to add to the topic, chime right in.
Sure.
But Dave Bradley from the UK did ask, given that most southern states made it illegal to teach slaves to read or write, is it likely that some of the letters were written by another person on the writer's behalf?
Yeah. So
with that, you might also how did they get educated about politics and
Yeah.
what was going on?
Great question. So what some enslaved people did was they, in their words, stole education. So Frederick Douglass famously did this by tricking white children into learning how to read and write. One of the correspondents in here learned how to read and write by bribing white children when he was in slavery. Another one wrote to Lincoln and said, I'm writing what I can based on what I stole, he says, from when he was in bondage. Our best estimates are that between 5 and 10% of enslaved people were in the United States by the time of the Civil War were literate. So somewhere between 5 and 10%. But then when, as early as May or June of 1861, missionaries and teachers begin coming to where I am here in Hampton Roads. And then in November of 1861, the Gideonites are going to the Sea Isles of South Carolina. And then teachers are spreading throughout there. And when Black men join the army, they are learning how to read and write from teachers and missionaries and soldiers. And so there is this massive push for Black education in this time period. Okay. And I'll point out that a lot of the modern scholarship has shown that it's not just white teachers, but there are Black teachers who are traveling to the South or who are rising up from the South and teaching former slaves how to read.
Okay, good. We do have a couple of excellent comments, or an excellent comment and a question from Rich Condon down there in Beaufort, South Carolina.
Beaufort. In South Carolina, it's Beaufort. In North Carolina, it's Beaufort. Rich can comment if I got that right.
All right, great. Rich wants to know, do any of the letters address hopes for Reconstruction in the Southern states, land ownership, labor reform, education, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number. I have a chapter that I call Seeking Economic Rights and Opportunities. And in this chapter, you have people who are writing to Lincoln about the land that they're on. Can I keep this land? I want to be able to develop it. Am I going to lose it? And so you have those letters from Virginia. You have those kind of letters from Louisiana. I know Rich is in South Carolina. I can't think off the top of my head if any from South Carolina came with that question. But yes, they're certainly thinking about that.
Now, Brian Steenbergen is watching from Michigan, and he did ask, how did you find the letters? How are they categorized? And Brian, that was something that Dan asked almost as soon as we started streaming this. So if you go back and watch it, you'll get John's question to how did he find these letters.
So can I add one little thing to that?
Of course.
So some of the letters are ones that I found in the National Archives while doing research for projects, but then most of them I found going through the Papers of Abraham Lincoln database online, and it's not a user-friendly website. And so what I did was I picked record groups and entries that I believed would bear fruit. But then I also, anytime in the course of my research on any project I'm working on, I came across the name of an African-American who was somewhat prominent in the Civil War era, I would then keyword search their name. And so I found a number of letters in just random places that no one would have found otherwise, and was able to include them in the book as well.
Great. Okay, last question from our customers, and sometimes the best questions are just the most simple and straightforward. And David Wiegers, thank you, is asking, how did the letters generally address Lincoln?
Mr. President, that's a great question.
Lincoln, how did they open their letters?
It's often, Honorable Mr. President or President of the United States. The one I mentioned before is unusual, where someone wrote to Abe Lincoln and Company. Usually they're very deferential, but, I called the book To Address You as My Friend. That's a quote from one of the letters. And a lot of these correspondents, when they write to Lincoln, they see him as a friend, or they say, I'm friendless and I have nowhere else to turn. And so for them, they see Lincoln, while they are deferential in their salutation, they are very personal in their communication.
All right. And then finally, Bill Gorski wants to know, what does Billy the Barber speak in his letter to Lincoln? How many letters did Billy write to Lincoln?
Billy has one letter. It's December 1863. he catches Lincoln up on the news from home. You know, your dog Fido's doing okay. Your house, the renters don't have any kids, so they're not tearing it apart. He thanks Lincoln for the Emancipation Proclamation. He says he hopes Lincoln will be reelected. He gives his condolences because Willie had died a year earlier. So it's a very personal news kind of letter.
Wonderful. Well, hey, Dan, we'll throw it back to you because I know you have a few more questions for John, and then I'll jump back in when we're ready to close out the conversation.
Okay, I mean, there are numbers of, I truly urge everyone to acquire this book, hopefully here, signed, but if not, somewhere, because there's a myriad of information in here you've not seen before, you've not heard before. These voices are new to us, and they really give substance, more substance, deeper substance to the Civil War era from those it was all about. I happen to have right here in back of me an 1833 sale auction of slaves. And we just got. It's always a surprise when you see them, but that's what the war was about. And you hear from some of these people now that we wouldn't have heard from before. Some of the things that we're not going to be able to get to, there was a great letter from Richard Hackley, who was an enslaved man in Virginia, who wrote that he hoped Lincoln would not be elected. He feared war more than anything else. There are wonderful stories in here that we didn't get to. One man, I'm not sure if I'm doing this correctly, Pajas B. Randolph, who
Paschal.
you call, what is it?
Paschal B. Randolph, yeah.
Paschal B. Randolph. You call him one of the most unusual 19th century characters. Read about it. You have to get the book to read and know about that.
Well, you have to include, you know, the big seller here is that he was a sex magician. And so he's writing to Lincoln. He met with Lincoln as well.
All right. It's in this book. General David Hunter, who was freeing slaves, and Lincoln had to remind him that he reserved that right to himself. And it's interesting, your comment, Jonathan, that was he hinting at emancipation that was going to come just the next month after that letter? Also, there's some fascinating things about discussions of Lincoln and equality, and should we judge Lincoln? Actually, I'm talking about that. Should we judge Lincoln by his actions? Does it matter? Well, I mean, I'm going to ask you that elevator question. Do you think it matters if it's be nice if Lincoln, and you're saying he wanted to free slaves, he hated slavery. We all think that in the Lincoln world positively, but over and above, I wonder if it really matters, because we have to judge him by his actions, and look what he did. A brief thought, very brief.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can judge him by both what he said and what he did. And the reality is, he said, "I've always hated slavery. I cannot remember a time when I did not so think and feel." That was April 1864. He said that. And you look back at his career, and I think that's true. And his thinking changed over time on certain issues in terms of Black voting rights and social equality for African Americans. He's not the same person in 1864 that he had been before the war on those issues. But, you know, so you mentioned Paschal Randolph, the sex magician. I'll tell a very quick story. Randolph met with Abraham Lincoln and was treated so well that he dedicated his book that he published in 1863 to Lincoln. Around the same time, Randolph meets with Robert Gould Shaw's father. So Robert Gould Shaw, the famous colonel who dies in the Scene and Glory, his father was an abolitionist. And when Randolph went to meet with Shaw's father to try to fight for raising Black troops and Black equality, Shaw's father kicks him out of his office. And Randolph says, "The only reason I was treated that way is because of the color of my skin." And so here is an abolitionist, Francis G. Shaw, who you would think is going to treat African Americans kindly and doesn't. Paschal Randolph has a very different experience when he meets with Abraham Lincoln. And I think it's notable that a politician behaves that way.
Well, as a book dealer here trying to sell your book, I think this is something we should have not told anyone, let them read the book. And there are many other stories just like that, which we're not going to tell you.
Exactly.
One thing I learned, though, talking about voting, Lincoln and voting, wanting to have some blacks vote, I learned that blacks could vote in 6 states.
Hmm.
Which states were those?
So very briefly,
Yeah,
at the time
elevator.
of the revolution, blacks could vote in as many as 11 or 12 of the states. And it's only during Jacksonian America that that right to vote is taken away. By the time of the Civil War, 5 states allow African Americans to vote, and then New York 5 northern states, and then New York allows black men with property. If they have a significant amount of property, they can vote. Ohio in 1860 allows, the Supreme Court allows black men with a certain lightness of skin to vote. And then I think it's New England states that also allow African American men to vote.
My last question, again, we're out of time, but very briefly, was there a fact that surprised you when you were doing your research? Something that, yeah, I didn't know that myself, or really thought was fascinating?
Oh, there were a lot. I mean, in digging up these voices again, because most of them haven't been heard for 155 years, being able to learn these stories, each one taught me something new, I think.
Okay, and it will teach us as well. Bjorn, thank you all from my point of view, and Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. And Bjorn, will you take us out? And
Well, and thank you.
that wonderful book.
Absolutely. And thank you everybody for watching. You make our jobs easier and you make our jobs harder because you challenge us with great questions. This program will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. So if you missed it live on the Facebook feed, you can see it later on the YouTube channel.
By the way, Bjorn,
Yes,
we're going to see Jonathan again
indeed.
in February 16th. So I
Okay.
hope you're all our viewers are on our list and get our notifications. If you liked him now, wait till this book comes out.
A House Built by Slaves. Yeah. And yeah, February 16th, and keep an eye out for our emails and our social media comments between now and then. Gentlemen, do either of you have anything to pitch in before we sign off today?
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again in a few months.
Exactly.
Thank you, and thank you, Dan. Thank you, everybody, for watching A House Divided. We will see you right here next time.